Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So I came across this story from France, and look, here in the U.S., we're used to attacking unions. We're used to attacking workers and taking their rights away and stealing from their wages. I mean, wage theft and misclassification and theft of workers' comp and unemployment insurance and all of those things. Much, much more costly to working people than all of the stick-em-up holdups, bank robberies, all that stuff in the country. In fact, not just more, but like triple more. So when I see a story of someone in another country wanting to go on off a union leader, I'm like, I should look at this. And we go to France, where this company boss said, hey, I'm going to pay 75,000 euros to off this union leader that we don't want them to come and ruin our family atmosphere here. And in fact, the guy agreed. She paid him 75 grand, and then the guy kind of backed off because the person that he was supposed to kill had kids. And good on a murderer hitman for having a conscience and not wanting to kill someone with children. Evidently, they found two other soldiers who were working with the French kind of CIA, who then were arrested and sold the whole thing out. And now we know. And my first thought was, this kind of horrible stuff happens all around the world, and probably here too. That we just don't hear about it because our media won't report on it. But again, I thought interesting. Anyway, here to share some thoughts on the big news of the day. ACA still alive. Yes, Virginia, we will have health care. I've asked our good friend Kevin Gannon to come talk with us. Kevin is the professor of history and the director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at Grandview University. Kevin, thanks for taking time for us.
Thanks, Rick. Great to be here with you again.
So yes, Kevin, we have health care. Is this the end of it, do you think? Do you think no more schemes, no more plots, no more assassination attempts, no more ticking bomb of the destruction of healthcare? Is this it, you think?
Well, in a reasonable society, one would probably say yes, but I think we have a lot of evidence to suggest that we don't live in a reasonable society. So who knows, right? I mean, by all rights and purposes, it should be. But, the way that we see the opponents of what they call Obamacare, the way that we see these sort of legal sophists twist their arguments, there's always another bottom, as they say. And those guys are in the bottom of the ditch, and they're going to keep digging, I think.
Now, I'm looking at I'm in this moment, and I'm paying attention to all the narratives that are being thrown out. Lazy working people who don't want to work because they're getting unemployment, greedy, all this stuff. And, the messaging machine funded by corporate America is unions bad, workers who want more bad, a better life for working people somehow bad. And this, as I said yesterday on the program, not new. Yesterday being the 103rd anniversary of Eugene V. Debs' speech from Canton that got him locked up for 10 years for having the audacity to say, no, I think we should not be promoting war. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Exactly. And, I'm glad you brought up Debs' speech. To give you an idea of how much of a Eugene Debs fanboy I am, my personal identification number for my old bank card, not my current one, but my old bank card, was his inmate number when he was in the Atlanta Federal Pen. He was prisoner 9653, and that was my pen for a number of years. So which is ironic, right? Because that's a functioning of capitalism right there. But, I mean, it just goes to show, as a historian, when you sort of, get a little higher over the landscape and you look at kind of where we are with this narrative as a country, you have all these signs on businesses that'll say, due to a labor shortage, we're closing at 10, which is basically, we don't want to pay people enough to get them to come and work for us. But yet we have this national mythology that people are supposed to put in the hard work and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and improve their station in life. So we say people are supposed to do that, and then we get really pissed at the people who are actually trying to do that. It's a no-win situation for working people, and it's always been a scam. But I don't think that the explicit scamminess has ever been as obvious as it is right now.
Yeah, they tell you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The sad reality is production of bootstraps have been moved to China.
Yes,
and when they bring them back, they don't work so well. It's just, more of the cheap plastic crap that we get. But the thing is I spend a lot of time talking to young people who are entering the workplace, becoming union members who know zero about what it took to get the things that they take for granted today: the 8-hour workday, weekends, overtime, safe working conditions, any of those things. And the education process really has to begin now, because we have fallen down on explaining, what the Debs of the world were fighting for, what the unions of the past, had to go through to win what we have now. And things, look, when I first started working, 30 plus years ago, things were better. Working conditions were better. Wages were better. Now it's been this all out assault of the last 40 years that's destroyed that.
Right, and you can track, the decline in sort of what we might call quality of life for the vast majority of Americans with the declining union membership, which tracks in a direct variation with the efforts of the federal government to basically union bust, right? And that's one of the things that I struggle with as a professor of history when I'm teaching the U.S. history courses is, I get students who come into my class and, we'll talk about Debs, and they've never heard of this guy before. And, you don't have to be pro-labor to agree that Eugene Debs is a toweringly important figure in that period of U.S. history. And it just goes to show that, what we have is this sort of sanitized narrative. There's, the emphasis is so much on trying to preserve some sort of consensus in the U.S. about how the past was and what made us the way we are today. And that consensus stands off all of the sharp edges of history, and we're left with this sanitized version that students sort of look at and they say, that doesn't sound right, and I'm not very engaged with it, but I don't know what is right, right? And so we get these sort of, we get almost this sort of nihilistic skepticism on the part of students. And I do think, there's something to be said for the connection between that and for why we see so much skepticism towards things like expertise today, right? Like there is a generation of folks who've come up who have very good reason not to trust what institutions have told them. But the problem is now that we've seen that weaponized, right? And we see people who are distrustful of anything like vaccines. I struggle with this as an educator because, in a position of power, you have to be able to use that power for good.
Right.
And so how do I do that without indoctrinating students? But how do I get students to pick up the tools and build their own understanding themselves? And things like labor and working class history are such a great component for students to be able to do that, because this is what jives with their own experiences.
No, absolutely. And, for a couple of years back, you had shows like Undercover Boss, that presented the CEOs in this caring kind of light, which is ridiculous. And then the show, The Men Who Built America, the titans and captains of industry who did, just horrible things. You never saw the real people who built this country. People like my grandfather and your grandfather and those folks who, bled, sweat, and died so that we could have, the buildings and the prosperity that we have.
Yeah, and the economic prosperity of the United States is literally the product of enslaved labor. The ultimate commodification of the working classes, right? Without the capital that's generated from cotton exports and the textile industry in New England, you don't have the funds that provide what becomes basically the slush money fund for industrialization in the late 19th century. That's the capital. Capital is drawn out of, what we might call the plantation slavery complex. And what's ironic about that is we can't even talk about that today with, the sort of climate against the critical race theory boogeyman and things like that. That, it seems to me that there's a sense on the part of the elites or those who, in whose interest it is to uphold kind of what we would call management, right? There's the sense they have that they are cornered, that the game is almost up. And the way that we see this sort of lashing out against things like whether it's, critical race theory or whether it's against, these darn millennials who don't want to work for more than $8 an hour, all the various, sort of attacks that we're seeing coming from this sector. I do think that they're related in that way.
No, you're absolutely right. And, I was just having this conversation today with a friend who's my age, and we work in the same industry. And I said, when we started working where we were at, I was on call for 11 years. The phone rings 2 hours later, I got to be at work. And this generation will have none of that. And I just looked at him, and he was like, can you believe they won't? I go, well, which generation was stupid?
Yeah, right.
Because we put up with it, and I'm going,
Right.
which generation is getting it right?
Yeah, you hear so much of this, today, like, I can't believe the outrageous things people want. Like in higher education right now, we're wrestling with the fact that for a lot of our staff at colleges and universities, some variation of blending of remote work actually works a lot better for these folks. But then there's that inherent managerial distrust that if they're not here where I can see them, then they're not really working, right? Like these things are so embedded with us. But you have to ask yourself, like, now that some of this stuff has been let out of the bottle, so to speak, you can't put it all back.
Right.
And I agree with you. That's, the terms of the sort of social contract for working people have been violated repeatedly. But now but that's all been on one side of the equation. And now that working people themselves are trying to reclaim some of that agency and control some of the terms of their own work, now we hear this narrative about how society is collapsing. I find that really telling.
Yeah, now that there are workers who have a little bit of power and saying, you know what, we're not going back to the desperate conditions. We're not going back to the poverty wages. And the weird thing is, and I talked about this yesterday on the program. I know some union folks who have fallen into that. They're buying the Fox News line. They're saying, these lazy people just need to go back to work. And I'm like, excuse me, having reasonable unemployment should be something we all want so that we're not desperate if it ever happens to us. In fact, what they're getting, the extra little bit, is what it should be anytime you're unemployed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what's ironic about all of this, too, all the criticism that's coming from the Fox News and from the right wing is this is basically everything that they say should be working, right? Like this is what they wanted. They want a complete free market. They want the individual economic actor to make the rational choice that's best for their own self-interest. And for, a 20-something-year-old kid, that's, my rational choice for my own self-interest is I'm not going to take $9.50 to work at Arby's. And now all of a sudden I'm the one who's ruining society. I did everything that y'all wanted me to do. And now I'm the bad guy. It's just the irony, the layers of irony here are remarkable.
Well, when you start following their ideology, because I have a lot of friends who they believe in the free market. And I'm like, did you not take Economics 101, where they told you that a free market, in order to have a truly free market, you have to be able to abstain? And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing people who are going, you know what? Not participating.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you look throughout U.S. history, when we have moments like this where working people have exercised the agency that they've always had, but maybe not really realize the full implications of that agency, but when they do feel, their power and they start to exercise that in ways that we're seeing today and in the decisions that they're making collectively, you can feel the shudder moving through the upper classes of society. I think it may not seem as dramatic to sort of look at, in terms of who's taking what jobs and things like that. But I do think we're at one of those moments where historians will look back on this period and see it as kind of a watershed moment for the way that work and working people and the role that they play in our society. I do think that the implications of this current moment are really big.
Yeah, I hope I'm around when the studies are written and they look back at this moment, because the spending that we've done to help folks at the bottom, to ensure that everyone had some income to get through the pandemic, that we help people through when they lost their jobs to be able to not lose everything and end up in worse conditions, which did exactly what conservatives, again, tell us that they believe. When there are less, when there's more demand for workers, the wages go up. That's happening. Maybe we'll see something positive out of it.
I think so. And, and COVID really laid bare the fundamental untruth of the sort of Reagan-esque mythology of the job creator. And, workers should be glad to have a situation where they, are paid any wages at all, right? Because it's the entrepreneurs that drive society. And, individual self-interest is what really, lifts all boats. That's a bankrupt, set of ideas. And COVID proved that. We are bound together as a society, and government does have a role to play in this. And working people are the backbone of what generates economic health in our society. We know that now. And so there are a lot of bubbles that got burst over the last year. And I think we're really starting to come to grips with that,
and I'm hoping,
which I find exciting.
No, I'm with you too, and I'm hoping at some point, because you had mentioned earlier that we used to listen to people who had expertise. We used to listen to smart people. And look, I don't claim to be the brightest bulb in the box. So I defer to people who I view as intelligent. I hope we go back to that. I hope we stop reading memes on Facebook with our mouth open and going, "Yep, I'll buy that," as opposed to listening to someone who has spent their life, studying something and giving their thoughts. I hope we return to some bit of critical thinking and critical analysis.
Yeah, and I think the important piece of that is for folks. When I listen to somebody, I should be listening to what they're saying and what their experience with that particular issue is, and not judging what they're saying by, does this person hate the same people I hate? Is this person on my team, so to speak? And we all, as human beings, we do have biases towards people that we're more comfortable with, and and that's fine. But if truth is defined solely by what team you play for, basically, which is kind of where we are right now. We're the real, that's a real problem. That's not a healthy society. That's not a functional society. And so I share your hope. But what I also hope for is that what we define as expertise, that the barriers to people acquiring that sort of expertise and experience are lower, and that more people get to share in that journey, and that more people are able to benefit from things like access to better education. Because that gets at this idea too of we want a nation of critically informed citizens. And that's the only way to get there is if we're helping people have access to the type of meaningful education that helps shape that.
And then maybe we can begin to look to the past and look at it with clear eyes instead of, well, the people who wrote it to try and make it as nice and as soft and as happy to fit one narrative or the other. Look, I don't know much about critical race theory, but I know my middle class, white working class folks that I deal with are adamantly opposed.
Well, and critical race theory has become the boogeyman for basically stuff that makes white people uncomfortable. It's actually kind of boring, when you define it specifically. It comes out of law schools, and the original articulations of what becomes known as critical legal studies basically argues that racism is a collective thing, that you can't just look at individual bad actors. And so when you look at legal outcomes and how come some cases are adjudicated one way and some the other way, that structural racism plays a part. And that's what it says. And we have plenty of empirical evidence to show that, yes, structural racism is a thing, right? But now it's been taken and cynically manipulated into this sort of wedge issue, prime culture war fashion. And in doing so, what it obscures is or what it does is it denies the reality of systems and groups in terms of shaping our society. And says that,
it basically things keep us stupid, so we don't analyze or ever talk about it, so that we can continue with our bias. It seems that simple to me. Kevin, I appreciate the time, thoughts. Always great having you on the program. I hope you'll come back and share some more with us.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Always a pleasure to be with you, and keep up the great work.
Thanks so much, our good friend Kevin Gannon. We'll get links out on how you can check out the work that he does. Quick break, right back. Stick the ground.
Remembering that united we bargain, divided we beg. Rick Smith.